January 1944, over the frozen heart of Germany, the sky burns silver. Dozens of B-17 bombers, the flying fortresses, crawl through thin, streaked contrails at 25,000 feet. The air is -40, engines trembling, fuel lines stiff with frost. Below them, a dark continent waits, cities, flak batteries, and the black arcs of rising smoke. For months, these American bombers had flown this path alone, deep into enemy airspace, beyond the reach of any friendly fighter. Every mile closer to Berlin meant fewer men coming home. But today, something new appears on the horizon. Sleek silhouettes with broad wings and the glint of sunlight off polished metal. The crews can hardly believe their eyes. These aren't turning back at the Rhine. They're staying with them, P-51 Mustangs, fast, graceful, with a range that stretched halfway across Europe. On the radios, someone whispers, "They're still with us." And that moment marks the turning of an air war, because across that same sky, Germany's once-feared Messerschmitt Bf-109s can barely climb to intercept, their fuel tanks already half empty before the fight begins. The question now is simple. How did America build a fighter that could fly 1,650 miles, while Germany's best ran out at 400? When the Second World War began in September 1939, the sky over Europe belonged to Germany. The Luftwaffe, a product of ruthless innovation and national ambition, was the most advanced air force on the planet. Its core fighter, the Messerschmitt Bf-109, was a symbol of that new mechanized might. Compact, light and deadly, it had already proven itself in Spain, outclassing Soviet and Republican aircraft with ease. In the early years of Blitzkrieg, it was perfect. Designed to leap from short airstrips, intercept enemy aircraft and return quickly, the Bf-109 wasn't meant for long journeys. It didn't need to be. Germany's wars were fought close to home, over France, Poland and the Low Countries. The fighter's mission was simple: support the army, control the immediate sky, then land to refuel for the next strike. Its range, roughly 400 miles, matched the tactical philosophy of Blitzkrieg itself. Short, decisive bursts of speed and shock. In 1940, that worked. When the Luftwaffe crossed the Channel for the Battle of Britain, however, that design began to show its limits. German fighters could only escort bombers for a short time before fuel forced them home. British pilots quickly learned to exploit that window, waiting until the 109s turned back, then tearing into the unguarded Heinkels and Dorniers. But Germany's air doctrine didn't change. The leadership, especially Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, believed the 109 was more than enough. To them, a longer range meant unnecessary weight. The Luftwaffe would win by overwhelming force, not endurance. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States Army Air Corps was still preparing for a war that hadn't yet arrived. American doctrine followed a different dream, one of massive, self-defending bomber formations. Their belief was simple and disastrously naive. The bomber will always get through. Engineers at Boeing and Consolidated designed the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator under that idea. Heavily armed, long-range bombers capable of carrying thousands of pounds of explosives deep into enemy territory. But those bombers were only as safe as the fighters that could protect them. And in 1939, America didn't have any that could. The U.S. fighter arsenal consisted of short-legged interceptors like the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk and the Bell P-39, Airacobra, aircraft with limited range, designed for defense rather than escort. The Pacific and European distances that loomed ahead were far beyond their reach. Still, when the U.S. entered the war in December 1941, optimism ruled. American air planners promised they could cripple the Nazi war machine by daylight precision bombing, striking factories, oil plants, and transport hubs with surgical accuracy. In 1942 and early 1943, the 8th Air Force, based in England, began that campaign. The first missions were cautious, targets in France, the Low Countries, Western Germany. Casualties were manageable. Then came the deeper strikes. Regensburg, Schweinfurt, Bremen, hundreds of miles into German territory. There, the illusion collapsed. Without long-range escorts, the B-17s and B-24s were easy prey. German radar stations tracked them as they crossed the Dutch coast. Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s took off in waves, attacking from altitude, head-on, cannon shells ripping through aluminum fuselages. Entire formations disappeared. On October 14, 1943, the second raid on Schweinfurt became known as Black Thursday. Out of 291 bombers that left England, 60 were shot down, and another 138 returned riddled with holes, many crash-landing back home. 600 men died in one day. The message was clear. The bombers could not survive without fighter protection, not just over the channel, but all the way to the target and back. That demand seemed impossible. No existing Allied fighter could fly that far. Fuel capacity, engine efficiency, and pilot endurance all fell short. The only hope was a new design, one that could rewrite the rules of range and performance. At that moment, almost by accident, the solution already existed. In a small, struggling factory in California, a company named North American Aviation had been asked to produce fighters under British contract. Rather than simply building another outdated design, their engineers, led by Edgar Schmude, a German immigrant, decided to create something entirely new. They called it the NA-73X. It was sleek, low drag, and aerodynamically unlike anything else in the sky. Its creators had no idea that it would soon become the most famous piston-engine fighter in history, and the weapon that would finally make the daylight bombing campaign possible. By the summer of 1943, the daylight skies over Europe had become a graveyard of metal. Every deep penetration raid by the U.S. 8th Air Force ended the same way. Broken formations limping back to England, gunners frozen at their posts, engines sputtering over the channel. The airmen called it the meat grinder. High Command knew that if something didn't change, the daylight bombing strategy, the cornerstone of American air power, would collapse entirely. The bombers were brave, but bravery couldn't outrun Messerschmitts. The solution, however, didn't begin in Washington or London. It began in a set of blueprints already collecting dust in a California workshop. When Britain had first approached North American Aviation in 1940, they wanted a new fighter to supplement their Spitfires and Hurricanes. The British Purchasing Commission gave North American only 120 days to deliver a prototype. Against all odds, they did. The result, the NA-73X, soon known as the Mustang MKY, was revolutionary in shape, but initially unimpressive in performance. It used an Allison V1710 engine, powerful at low altitudes, but gasping for air above 15,000 feet, far below bomber cruising height. The RAF used it mostly for reconnaissance and ground attack, but British test pilots noticed something remarkable. Even at high speed, the Mustang's wings produced minimal drag. Its fuselage seemed to cut through the air like a blade. The reason lay in its laminar flow wing, a new aerodynamic profile that delayed airflow separation, drastically reducing drag. In theory, this design could make the Mustang both faster and more fuel-efficient than anything flying. All it needed was the right engine. That engine came from Britain too, the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same power plant that gave the Spitfire and Hurricane their edge in the Battle of Britain. In 1942, Rolls-Royce engineers mounted a Merlin into a Mustang airframe as an experiment. The transformation was instant. The plane's speed jumped to over 430 miles per hour. It could climb faster than a Spitfire, dive longer without losing control, and, most critically, cruise far more efficiently. Word spread quickly. The British sent their test data to America, where the Packard Company began producing the Merlin under license. The new model, designated the P-51B, was born. Its performance was so superior that even skeptical U.S. commanders took notice. General James H. Jimmy Doolittle, then leading the 8th Air Force, understood immediately what it meant. With drop tanks attached beneath its wings, the Mustang could escort bombers not just to the German border, but to Berlin and back. In late 1943, the first P-51Bs arrived in England. They were still unproven, their long-range capabilities not yet tested in combat. But the timing couldn't have been more critical. After the catastrophic Schweinfurt raid, the 8th Air Force had temporarily halted deep raids into Germany. Morale was shaken. Pilots whispered that unescorted bombing was suicide. Then came the first missions with Mustangs. In December 1943, P-51s flew with B-17s bound for Bremen. For the first time, the bombers reported seeing their escorts all the way to the target and home again. It was a revelation. German intelligence couldn't believe it at first. No fighter, they thought, could possibly cross 1,500 miles of enemy airspace, fight and return. Yet the evidence was impossible to ignore. The P-51s began to appear in places that had once been safe, above Hanover, above Berlin, even near the Luftwaffe's own bases. Their range changed not just tactics but psychology. German pilots, once confident that American fighters would turn back, suddenly found themselves attacked deep in their own skies. For the Luftwaffe, already stretched thin by years of war, this was the beginning of the end. But for the Americans, the P-51's arrival meant more than survival. It meant the possibility of air supremacy, to seize control of the skies not just by numbers, but by endurance and engineering. As 1944 dawned, the stage was set for the greatest aerial struggle of the European war. The bombers would fly again toward Germany's industrial heart, but this time they would not fly alone. The engineering angle, the anatomy of endurance. Every warplane carries the philosophy of its creators in its design. The Bf-109 was built for the Blitz, quick, sharp, and unforgiving. The P-51 Mustang was built, almost accidentally, for the long war. At the core of the Mustang's superiority was efficiency. Its laminar flow wing, first tested in the late 1930s at the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, reduced drag by keeping airflow smooth along most of the wing's surface. Where older wings created turbulence and resistance, the Mustang sliced through the sky like a blade. This meant one thing: range. The same engine power that carried a Spitfire a few hundred miles could push a Mustang nearly twice as far. Combined with the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin, the aircraft achieved something that seemed impossible for a piston-engine fighter: high altitude. High-speed flight sustained over hours without losing power, but endurance alone wasn't enough. The Mustang's designers, led by Edgar Schmude, understood that a long-range fighter had to be livable. Its cockpit was spacious by comparison to its German counterpart. Controls were intuitive, visibility was excellent, and the aircraft handled predictably, even under stress. It carried internal fuel tanks of over 180 gallons, nearly double what the Bf-109 could manage. And external drop tanks added hundreds more miles. The pilot could jettison them before combat, instantly transforming the aircraft from a long-range escort into a nimble dogfighter. The Germans tried to compensate. Later versions of the Bf-109, like the G6 and G10, featured larger tanks and improved engines, such as the Daimler-Benz DB605. But every modification added weight, disrupted balance, and reduced agility. By 1944, the Messerschmitt had reached the limits of its design. Meanwhile, the Mustang's airframe still had room to grow. Its laminar wings and sleek fuselage were so efficient that even when fully loaded, it could cruise economically at 300 map. When German fighters met it in combat, many Luftwaffe aces were shocked. The P-51 could dive faster, climb faster, and still fight at the edge of its fuel limits. That difference in design philosophy, short-range aggression versus long-range endurance, reflected the strategic divide between the two nations. The strategic angle. The shift in doctrine in 1942 The United States believed bombers could defend themselves. By 1943, that belief was dead. The brutal losses over Schweinfurt and Regensburg forced a transformation in Allied air strategy. What had begun as independent bomber operations evolved into escort integrated missions, where fighters became equal partners in offense. This wasn't merely tactical, it was psychological. The Mustang's extended reach allowed the Allies to strike the Luftwaffe where it lived. German interceptors could no longer pick their battles. They were being hunted. In early 1944, General Jimmy Doolittle issued a controversial but decisive order. Fighter escorts were no longer to remain tied to bomber formations. Instead, they were free to roam ahead, seek out and destroy the Luftwaffe before the bombers even arrived. It was a radical shift. The old escort doctrine, protect the bombers at all costs, was replaced by a new offensive mindset. Clear the skies entirely. The P-51 made that possible. Its range allowed squadrons to sweep deep into German territory, patrolling airfields, ambushing interceptors as they climbed. In essence, the hunter had become the hunted. The Luftwaffe had never faced such a threat. Its defensive network depended on localized response, radar stations guiding short-range fighters to intercept points. But by the time the P-51 entered full service, the Luftwaffe's entire structure began to collapse. Pilots couldn't rest, fuel convoys were attacked, and airfields once considered safe were bombed daily. What had once been a contained battle for air superiority became a war of exhaustion, and Germany was running out of both pilots and fuel. The contrast was profound. The Bf-109's short legs confined it to a shrinking circle of defense, while the Mustang's long reach turned every mile of German airspace into a battlefield. By early 1944, that strategic shift was visible everywhere, in the skies above the Reich, in the reports filed by shattered Luftwaffe units, and in the growing confidence of American crews who, for the first time, knew they wouldn't be left alone. And yet, the true story of this aerial transformation wasn't just about metal and fuel. It was also human. The men inside those cockpits lived the consequences of range, endurance, and survival every single day. The human angle, the men behind the machines, for all the engineering brilliance of the P-51 Mustang. Its true power came alive only when a man climbed into the cockpit and faced the horizon. In early 1944, the pilots of the 8th Air Force began flying the new Mustangs across the North Sea. Most were barely in their 20s. Farm boys, factory workers and college students turned aviators. Their training had taught them precision, but experience would teach them survival. To them, the difference between life and death was often measured in gallons of fuel. Each long-range mission meant sitting for 6, sometimes 8 hours, through bitter cold, deafening noise and unbroken tension. They learned to trust their machines completely. The Merlin engine's deep growl became their heartbeat, the smell of high-octane fuel their companion. They carried names like George Preddy, John C. Meyer, and Bud Anderson, young men who would become legends. Preddy alone would score 26 aerial victories, most of them while escorting bombers to Berlin. When bomber crews saw those silver fighters still circling above them after hours of flight, morale soared. A Fortress gunner once recalled, "When I saw a Mustang up there at the end of a mission, I knew I was going home." Across the sky, the men in Bf-109s faced an entirely different reality. German pilots entered combat already outnumbered. Many were veterans of Spain or the early Blitz, superbly skilled but physically and mentally exhausted. By 1944, most were flying multiple sorties a day with dwindling fuel supplies. Each flight meant rationing power, calculating risk, and praying for enough gasoline to return home. The Luftwaffe's once elite Jagdgeschwader, fighter wings like JG-26 and JG-52, still produced aces such as Erich Hartmann and Adolf Galland, but even they saw the balance turning. New recruits arrived with barely 100 flight hours. Some were dead within a week. The Mustang pilots flew with the advantage of abundance, better training, better logistics, better rest. Their aircraft were newer, their engines reliable, and their missions supported by a vast industrial machine. By contrast, every German sortie was a gamble. Mechanics drained one aircraft to fuel another. Replacement parts were scarce. Airfields were bombed before dawn. For the Luftwaffe's young pilots, it wasn't just a battle for air superiority. It was survival inside a collapsing system. The industrial angle, factories, fuel, and fate behind every aircraft, lay an entire nation's ability to sustain the fight. By 1943, American industry had achieved a level of production no other country could match. Ford's massive Willow Run plant in Michigan produced a B-24 bomber every hour. North American Aviation's assembly lines built P-51s in waves, thousands per month by 1944. Each aircraft represented the coordination of an entire continent. Engines built by Packard in Detroit, propellers from Hamilton Standard, instruments from small factories in Chicago and Cleveland. Trains and ships carried them to ports, and convoys delivered them to Britain faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. For every P-51 lost in combat, 2 more were already on the way. Germany, on the other hand, was being strangled from the sky. Allied bombing campaigns, ironically, the very missions the Mustangs were designed to protect, targeted not just factories, but the lifeblood of the Luftwaffe, fuel. Synthetic oil plants at Leuna, Merseburg, and Pulitz burned for days after each raid. Aviation gasoline became scarce. Fighter groups were grounded not because they lacked planes, but because they lacked the fuel to fly them. The Bf-109, though simple by design, was expensive to maintain. Its narrow landing gear made takeoffs treacherous, its engine delicate under stress, and its performance tied directly to high-octane fuel, the very resource Germany was losing fastest. American pilots flew 3 or 4 times a week. German pilots, if lucky, might fly once. Some squadrons resorted to towing their planes by horse when fuel ran out. The industrial imbalance was absolute. The Mustang wasn't just a marvel of design. It was a product of scale, the manifestation of an industrial democracy's total mobilization. Where the Luftwaffe fought on desperation and improvisation, the Allies fought with rhythm and resources. Each P-51 that rose from an English airfield carried not only 180 gallons of fuel, but the collective weight of a nation's factories, engineers, and workers. Each Bf-109 that struggled into the sky carried the dwindling hopes of a Reich running on fumes. By mid-1944, the difference was visible in every contrail. One side's grew thicker, stretching farther into the blue. The others thinned and vanished, and soon that imbalance would reach its breaking point, a moment when the air war over Europe would tip forever in one direction. January 1944. The war in the air had reached a knife's edge. Germany still commanded the heart of Europe, but its skies were growing dangerous. At dawn, the concrete runways of eastern England thundered with the sound of new engines. Squadrons of P-51Bs, their wings loaded with fuel tanks and ammunition, lined up for takeoff. The mission? Escort B-17s and B-24s deep into Germany, beyond Bremen, beyond Hanover, all the way to the industrial heart of the Reich. Until now, that kind of mission had been a death sentence. The bombers had always been abandoned halfway, left to fend for themselves over enemy territory. But this time something had changed. The Mustangs wouldn't turn back. At 0700 hours, the first formations crossed the English coast. Below, the North Sea shimmered under winter light, endless grey waves and low cloud. Above, the temperature dropped below freezing, frost creeping over windshields. Each pilot knew the stakes. They were flying into the Luftwaffe's home territory, a sky once ruled by the black crosses of Bf-109s and Fu-190s. The Germans scrambled early, their radar networks detecting the incoming waves. At airfields near Bremen, Oldenburg, and Münster, the familiar sound of Daimler-Benz engines filled the air. Mechanics pulled chocks, and the Bf-109s roared to life. Among them were veterans, men who had fought since 1939. They still believed in their aircraft. even as its range confined them to defense. The 19 could climb fast, strike hard, and escape in a dive. But it couldn't stay. As the bomber stream approached Bremen, contrails tangled into thick white ropes. Dozens of German fighters dove from the sun, their 20mm cannons flashing. For months, this moment had always ended the same way. Burning bombers. Open parachutes, silence, not this time. From altitude, the P-51 Mustangs dropped their fuel tanks and turned to meet the attackers head-on. Sleek, silver, and deadly, they screamed through the formation, diving at over 400 miles per hour. The Luftwaffe pilots, expecting an easy pass, found themselves under fire, tracers whipping past their canopies. Merlin engines howling like sirens. One German veteran later described that day as the moment the sky changed color. The Americans fought with a freedom the Luftwaffe hadn't seen before. They could pursue enemies deep into German territory without worrying about fuel. They could climb, dive, and still have range to return home. Within minutes, the first Bf-109s were falling in flames. Others broke off, engines coughing from hits. The bombers pressed on, for the first time not alone. It was a test, and the Mustang passed it flawlessly. Over the next weeks, the 8th Air Force repeated the experiment, missions to Frankfurt, Leipzig, and Brunswick. Each time, the P-51s extended farther, hunting Luftwaffe fighters before they could reach the bombers. The effect was immediate and devastating. German ground controllers began reporting enemy fighters over their own airfields. Pilots returning from missions found Mustangs waiting to ambush them during landing approaches. In one intercepted transmission, a Luftwaffe controller shouted in disbelief, "Sie sind überall." They are everywhere. For the first time, the defenders of the Reich felt hunted. The Luftwaffe tried to respond. Bf-109 squadrons flew tighter intercept patterns, conserving fuel and attacking in coordinated bursts. But each sortie burned precious gasoline, a resource Germany could no longer replace. The Reich's synthetic fuel plants were already struggling under constant bombing. Even when pilots survived, they returned to airfields that had no fuel for another mission. By February, the Allies were ready to press the advantage. They planned something larger than any single raid, a campaign designed to break the Luftwaffe once and for all. It would be called Operation Argument. But to those who fought in it, the name that endured was simpler, Big Week, a 7-day storm of steel and fire, where the P-51 Mustang would prove not just its range, but its power to change the war itself. February 20th, 1944. Before dawn, the runways of England lit up like rows of fire. One after another, B-17s and B-24s lumbered into the sky, hundreds of them, their wings heavy with bombs bound for the heart of Germany's war machine. The operation's goal was not a single city or factory, but the Luftwaffe itself. Allied command called it Operation Argument. The men who flew it called it Big Week. For 6 days, wave after wave of bombers would strike Germany's aircraft industry, assembly plants, engine works, ball-bearing factories, anything that could build or sustain a fighter plane. The plan was bold and brutal: draw the Luftwaffe into open combat and destroy it in the air. And this time, the bombers would not be alone. Above them, stretching across the cold February sky, flew the new long-range Guardians, the P-51 Mustangs of the 8th and 15th Air Forces. Their external fuel tanks gleamed in the thin morning light, carrying just enough gasoline to reach beyond Leipzig, Augsburg, and Regensburg, the deep industrial zones once considered untouchable. When the first formations crossed into German airspace, radar stations screamed warnings. Controllers across the Reich barked into their headsets, "Feindverband im Anflug." Enemy formation incoming. From bases at Augsburg, Brunswick, and Frankfurt, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs scrambled into the sky. They climbed in pairs and fours, black smoke curling behind them, the old rhythm of defense beginning once more. But this time, something was wrong. instead of unprotected bombers lumbering alone through the clouds. The German pilots found themselves facing swarms of Mustangs and Thunderbolts, sleek, fast and ready for the kill. The first major clash erupted over Leipzig. Luftwaffe interceptors, numbering over 200, dove on the bomber streams, only to be intercepted by roving Mustang squadrons already waiting at altitude. The sky dissolved into chaos, engines screamed, machine guns rattled in endless bursts. Contrails twisted into vapor scars as Mustangs and Messerschmitts rolled and dove through the thin, frozen air. At one point, the 357th Fighter Group, nicknamed the Yoxford Boys, engaged nearly twice their number and held them off long enough for the bombers to reach their targets. One pilot described looking down and seeing entire industrial complexes erupt in flame, a furnace that stretched for miles. The Luftwaffe fought ferociously. They had no choice, but every minute they stayed in the air burned fuel they couldn't replace. Every pilot lost was a man who couldn't be replaced. By the third day, the cracks began to show. German mechanics reported aircraft grounded for lack of fuel. Replacement engines arrived late or not at all. Airfields that had once been secure were now under constant attack, strafed by Mustangs after each mission. On February 23rd, a P-51 group under Colonel Donald Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group swept deep past the bomber stream, striking airfields around Gotha and Erfurt. They destroyed dozens of German fighters before they even took off. It was a new kind of warfare, not defense, but extermination. By February 25th, the Luftwaffe's operational strength had collapsed. Over 500 German aircraft were destroyed in a single week, and hundreds more damaged beyond repair. The Allies lost heavily, too, over 200 bombers and dozens of fighters, but the difference was clear. The Allies could replace their losses. Germany could not. Big Week didn't just cripple the Luftwaffe's factories, it shattered its soul. The surviving German pilots returned to their bases to find fuel depots burning, hangars wrecked, and their comrades gone. Commanders tried to rally them, promising the new Me-262 jet would soon restore dominance. But those were promises for another world, one that no longer existed. The P-51 Mustang had done more than escort bombers. It had broken the Luftwaffe's rhythm, the constant cycle of intercept, retreat, and refuel that had once defined Germany's defense. From that point onward, the Luftwaffe would never again control the skies over Europe. The balance of power had shifted irreversibly. The Reich's heartland, its factories, oil plants, and transport lines lay open to daylight attack, and as Allied bombers thundered home over the North Sea, their crews looked out across the clouds and saw something they'd never seen before. Hundreds of Mustangs still with them, wings level, engines steady. The sky that had once belonged to Germany was now guarded by American steel, but victory in the air was not the end. It was only the beginning of Germany's collapse. The consequences of Big Week would ripple through every front, every field, every city touched by the shadow of war. The end of Big Week did not bring silence to the skies over Germany, only a new kind of roar. From March 1944 onward, the Allies owned the air. The 8th Air Force and 15th Air Force launched daily raids that reached deeper and deeper into the Reich, striking oil plants, rail hubs, and weapons factories with methodical precision. For the first time in the war, the Luftwaffe could no longer protect its own homeland. Every German pilot who climbed into a Bf-109 knew the odds. They were outnumbered, outfueled, and increasingly outtrained. New recruits, boys barely 18, were being rushed into cockpits after just 60 flight hours. Their instructors had already been killed in earlier battles. Fuel shortages grew catastrophic. Even practice flights were restricted. Entire squadrons were grounded for lack of aviation gasoline. The synthetic fuel facilities at Leuna and Pölitz, vital to Germany's war effort, became prime targets. Each raid burned millions of gallons of irreplaceable fuel. Smoke hung for days over Saxony and Thuringia, and the Bf-109s that survived Big Week now sat silent, engines idle, wings gathering frost. Meanwhile, the Mustang squadrons surged forward. They patrolled every corner of occupied Europe, escorting bombers one day, sweeping rail lines the next. They strafed locomotives, convoys, airfields, and even individual trucks moving along the Autobahn. By May 1944, the Luftwaffe's frontline fighter force was only a shadow of its former self. Reports from Jagdgeschwader commanders told the same story: heavy losses. No replacements, no fuel. Even Germany's ace pilots, men like Adolf Galland, Walter Nowotny and Johannes Steinhoff, were increasingly trapped in hopeless defense. They could still win individual duels, but the strategic tide was unstoppable. On the Allied side, the effect was transformative. The bombing campaign that once seemed doomed now became a relentless engine of destruction. Factories in Berlin, Munich, and Hamburg were leveled in daylight. Transportation networks collapsed under continuous assault. When the Normandy invasion approached in June 1944, the Luftwaffe could barely respond. Out of nearly 800 operational fighters stationed in France, only a fraction managed to take off during D-Day. Those that did were swarmed by P-51s and P-47s patrolling overhead. The Germans had lost not just the ability to fight the air war, they had lost the air itself. It was more than tactical. It was psychological. Before, Allied bomber crews had flown in fear, counting the minutes until the German fighters appeared. Now it was the Luftwaffe's turn to wait, listening to the thunder of Mustangs circling above their own airfields. Even civilians felt the shift. The once defiant confidence of the German home front began to crumble under the constant daylight bombings. Nowhere was safe. In April 1944, American reconnaissance photographs showed something astonishing. German aircraft scattered across roads, meadows, and forest clearings, desperate attempts to hide them from the skies that no longer belonged to them. Every strategic goal of the Mustang program had been achieved. The daylight bombing campaign, once suicidal, had become the decisive tool of Allied victory. And yet amid the smoke and triumph, a quiet truth lingered. Technology alone had not won the war. It was the doctrine behind it, the belief that endurance and range could achieve what speed and aggression could not. The Luftwaffe's short-range design philosophy, born from Blitzkrieg, had trapped it within its own borders. The P-51's philosophy, thus born of patience, adaptability, and distance, had freed the Allies to strike anywhere, anytime. The skies over Europe told that story clearly, one side confined, the other unbound. But the aftermath of Big Week reached even farther, beyond the collapse of the Luftwaffe, into the deeper consequences for Germany's entire war economy and its final desperate months. By the summer of 1944, Germany's once mighty Luftwaffe was no longer a shield. It was a scar. The relentless pressure from the P-51 escorted bombers had broken not only the air arm but also the logistical arteries of the Reich. The aircraft industry, fuel production, and transportation networks lay in ruin. Every Allied sortie now deepened the collapse. In May and June, American Mustangs and Thunderbolts swept across France and Western Germany in near-continuous missions. They strafed trains carrying troops to the front, ambushed truck convoys, and shredded airfields that once sent up waves of Messerschmitts. The Luftwaffe's leaders watched helplessly as their squadrons evaporated. They still received new aircraft, late-model Bf-109Gs and FW-190As, but there was no fuel to fly them. No veteran pilots to guide the newcomers. Adolf Galland, once one of Germany's most celebrated fighter aces, later recalled in his memoirs that by mid-1944, our airfields were full of planes that could not take off. Even when Germany introduced the revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter, it was too late. The skies belonged to the Mustangs. Allied pilots ambushed the jets on takeoff or landing, where they were most vulnerable. The few that reached altitude lacked numbers or fuel to make a difference. By the fall of 1944, American and British intelligence estimated that Germany was losing over 400 fighters a month. While producing barely enough fuel to keep a fraction operational, the Allies, by contrast, were flying with abundance. The United States had built nearly 15,000 P-51s. By war's end, each one capable of escorting bombers all the way from England to Berlin and back. The Mustang's range and reliability transformed Allied strategy. No longer confined to striking targets within the limits of short-range fighters, the air campaign expanded into a weapon of total paralysis. Oil refineries, marshalling yards, synthetic rubber plants, ball-bearing works, and rail junctions were systematically erased. German troops retreating from the east or west found themselves bombed at every bridge and road. By early 1945, Luftwaffe sorties had fallen by more than 80%. What little resistance remained came from a few desperate pilots flying from improvised fields, sometimes with barely enough fuel for a single attack run. The men who once dominated the European skies, from the Battle of Britain to the steppes of Russia, were now hunted, exhausted, and ground into silence. Yet the P-51's triumph was not merely a tactical or strategic achievement. It reshaped aviation itself. When peace returned, every major air force studied the lessons written in those cold European skies. The world learned that speed alone was no longer supreme. Range, efficiency, and balance defined victory in the age of air power. The Mustang's laminar flow wing, its long-range fuel system, and its ability to operate at high altitude became the design foundation for post-war fighters, including early jets. Even the engineers who built Germany's Me-262 admitted admiration for the P-51's elegance and endurance. In 1946, at air bases across occupied Europe, captured Messerschmitts and Mustangs sat side by side. Their comparison told a simple truth. One had been built to strike quickly and retreat, the other to stay, to endure. That endurance had won the war. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the wreckage of the Luftwaffe lay scattered across hundreds of ruined airfields, charred Bf-109s, twisted FW-190s, and silent hangars. Above them, the last Mustangs still circled, engines humming in the spring air, guardians of a sky that had once been filled with fire. The age of the long-range fighter had begun, and with it, a new chapter in aerial warfare, one written by a machine that could fly farther, fight longer, and change the very nature of war from above. The war in Europe ended not with a single battle, but with silence. When the last echoes of gunfire faded over Berlin, the skies that had once roared with thousands of engines stood calm again, and in that stillness, the story of the P-51 Mustang lingered. It was a machine born not from perfection, but from necessity, a design meant for speed that became a symbol of endurance, an aircraft that bridged continents, outlasted its enemies, and gave men in fragile bombers a fighting chance to come home. The Mustang's victory was never just about range or fuel tanks. It was about what those miles meant, the ability to reach where others could not, to endure when others could not, to stand watch over a mission to its very end. Its success reshaped the idea of air power itself. Before the Mustang, wars were fought at the edge of possibility, limited by distance, by logistics, by fear of the unknown horizon. After it, the horizon no longer mattered, and yet, behind the polished aluminum and perfect aerodynamics lay something deeply human. Courage carried through endurance. Every pilot who climbed into that cockpit knew that range was not only about fuel, it was about faith. Faith that technology could carry men further than fear could stop them. For Germany, the story of the Bf-109 was the opposite. Brilliant at the start, doomed by its limits. It represented the philosophy of a lightning war, sharp, fast, and unsustainable. For America, the Mustang was the opposite of blitzkrieg, slow to arrive, patient to evolve, and unstoppable once mature. When history looks up at those contrails frozen in black and white photographs, It sees more than aircraft. It sees an evolution of thought, from short reach to long vision, from quick victories to lasting endurance. The P-51 Mustang didn't just win the war in the air. It redefined what the air could be, infinite, open, unbroken, and long after the last Mustang touched down, that idea remained. That with enough courage and enough range, even the farthest horizon can be reached.